going to point you toward the QR code to get a little bit more about everybody's background. So I'm going to dive right into the questions, which I've been instructed to do. And the topic for today is how we can advance technology in order to address the health equity gap that we see globally. So we know that there are about 2 billion people who don't have access to medicines and vaccines and healthcare overall. So I want to start here with Tisha and ask a question to you about how you've seen the use of early diagnostics. And I know a little bit about what you've done with TB, but if you could just talk a little bit about what we might be able to learn from your case example at Siemens.
Sure, and yeah, my name's Tisha Boatman. I'm from Siemens Healthineers. I head up government affairs as well as our health access business. I mean, Siemens Healthineers is a company that does a lot in diagnostics, lab diagnostics, imaging diagnostics, as well as intervention. But I think we do that in partnership, almost always in partnership. And I think real innovation doesn't come without real partnership. The example I want to start with today is around tuberculosis. We're a company that's well known in X-ray and CT and everything around radiology. And the WHO a couple of years ago made a recommendation that TB screening begin with a X-ray. It's cheaper than using the sputum test, and it gives you much faster on the result. So the idea of screen and treat on the spot. But the challenge with X-ray, like most imaging, has always been, how do you read those X-rays? Where are all these radiologists in low, middle income countries? And let's be honest, it's not realistic to send this stuff to the cloud and get an answer. You don't have the broadband. You don't have the stability of networks. So we are partnered with a company called Cure AI, which is an Indian company and has a leading, it's not our AI. People, always assume that we're using our own stuff. We don't make the best stuff in TB screening, so we use Cure. And we're doing a program in the Philippines to optimize the throughput with AI screenings. One of the other things we learned from the Global Fund is they've been funding AI for some time, but they're not seeing an increase in patient throughput. They're not seeing an increase in diagnostic. They're still having a very high footprint of undiagnosed patients in high TB prevalence areas. So we believe that we can be the partner in how to optimize the implementation of AI. And importantly here, this is the first AI in the world where it is the recommendation that you don't require a physician to read it. Okay, you do not require a radiologist to read it. Now, this is for screening. When you get to diagnostic, you're using a sputum test. That comes from Cepheid, if you weren't aware. There's other players, but it's really Cepheid around the world. And there you have it. So from our perspective, there's a partnership with a small company. There's a partnership with a major funder like the Global Fund. And there's aspects of how do you really implement AI to achieve better outcomes on the ground. That'll be an example that we hope to scale to many other countries, but started in the Philippines.
Thank you for sharing that. Another thing that I understand that you've been working quite a lot on is just this data inequity. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about how your company is looking at that and ways to get on top of that. And one thing I've been hearing about while I'm here is putting the patient at the center of that and try to equalize the data that's going into these algorithms. So if you could address that, that would be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, we always worry in innovation that is first introduced and often tested in the developed countries, in the developed health systems, where it may not necessarily be really applicable in low and middle income countries. And AI is no different, right? There is a significant data bias. So the example I like to bring up is breast cancer. I'm a breast cancer survivor. I went through my treatment and therapy during COVID in Denmark, in one of the national health systems and a very high-end health system, if you don't know Denmark. But when you look at again, Siemens does make AI, but again, I'm going to talk about somebody else's AI. So there's a company called Transpera in the Netherlands, which is one of the premium AI solutions in the EU for breast cancer reading. Radiologists around the world, it's a very difficult read, and many radiologists who read everything else don't read breast because it is a very difficult read. So you have mammography systems sitting around the world where they're not fully optimized to have the throughput because, you don't have anybody to read it. So in this case, the Transpera AI is a great solution approved in the EU for some time now and is what they've used in this huge Sweden study that people often refer to. But it's not optimized for the Asian dense breast. And when you think, women are not all created equal. The breast is very different. There's a huge difference in the ability for an algorithm to detect. And yet, many of our databases that we all use to develop have strong bias in them to the Western or the developed world's body, right? So how do you really do that? We've put a lot of effort into validating that particular algorithm, both in the public and private systems. In this case, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam. And there in Vietnam, it's with privates. But really, before you deploy this, you need strong, unbiased data sets. They're very difficult to acquire. If we get to it later on, we can talk about some ideas around how do patients maybe pay for scanning with their data, because patients have a very powerful tool, and that's their diverse data sets, and it's certainly anonymized data sets. But I think I'll leave it there, hear what our other panelists have to say.
Yeah.
Yep.
Does anyone want to add to that, or we can move on to a different topic?
I think what I would add to it is, and by the way, it's interesting, this is my third day hearing about a radiologist joke and a radiologist and AI. It's interesting how that specific job category has so much implication on AI. But what I'd say is that the way we think about it at HP is that when we look at specific verticals, automotive is one example, healthcare is another. Data, and in the world of AI, has a lot of privacy and security implications. And the way we think about AI is that AI deployed at the edge or at the endpoint allows for a different level of security and privacy that's unique to the customer, unique to the patient, unique to the hospital network, et cetera. And that's how we think about it. There are use cases that warrant that. And in doing so, the AI that's deployed is actually different. They need to use small language models, sometimes tiny language models deployed at the endpoint, inference at the endpoint. So you have the capability, but the data resides and remains at the edge, and it's secured wherever the customer wants it.
And I'll just piggyback off of that. At Sunflower Network, we're using prefabricated modular technology to build hospitals, starting in Ukraine, a program that we intend to scale across the world. And I set that context because I think what some people don't always think about is the applications of AI beyond just the handling of information, which is kind of the classic archetypal use case. So for us, we are literally building a hospital in giant Lego-esque pieces in a factory in a different country that then gets brought in. So you might say, okay, where's the data, the analysis of scans? How does that intersect with AI? Well, AI has implications on the built environment, on the physical environment, on the way that physical buildings and real estate and infrastructure is constructed. It enables robotics to drive down the cost of building permanent infrastructure. And so I'm an optimist. I can't help but be an optimist. But I think the implications of this new technological development are so much bigger than any of us are even thinking about.
Yeah, you said you look like you want to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to jump in from the mental health perspective. I think context is important. Just briefly, what problem are you trying to solve with technology and not the other way around? In the U.S., half of folks with a mental illness receive no treatment. And of those who do, half receive ineffective or treatment that's not evidence-based. So there's a huge both access and quality challenge. And that's true internationally, globally as well. And in our global health work, it's been really interesting the last 6-7 years. The first topic that ministers of health want to talk about is mental health, which as a psychiatrist, that's been really cool to see. But I think the technology needs to be put in a proper context. So I'll just say this is, you need to build an ecosystem, a continuum of care that has access and quality built in. And that starts with prevention and thinking about, folks who are experiencing stress, distress, difficulty sleeping, don't need a therapist or psychiatrist, but need some added support. And in that domain, there's a lot what technology can do in terms of peer support, digital therapy, sort of wellness and sort of mindfulness, CBT type digital with a text-based coach. And I think that's promising. There's a lot of products out there. Most of them are not FDA approved in the US context, so there's not really a business model to prescribe, but that's coming. I think a second context for the continuum is just thinking about integration and how you embed behavioral health in contexts where people routinely engage. So this could be, primary care, it's MHGAP, or it's collaborative care in the U.S., it's schools. We do a lot of work with clergy who are front lines, so training clergy and lay counseling is, I think, a really powerful example of expanding workforce and overcoming stigma and technology there. From a workforce development standpoint, we're not there yet, but I think Craig mentioned, the role of AI and a training coach bot to help develop skills in clinicians, I think is really promising. So moving beyond traditional CME, which doesn't work, to an ambient listening device that's listening to your interaction with the patient or the client and giving you real-time feedback. Hey, you missed that, or you might ask about this. And when you look at training, what we've learned in the Global South is you can train non-professionals to deliver empirically supported psychosocial interventions, CBT, whatever. It's effective, but one of the issues, it takes training. And I think the technology right now, we have apps that kind of deliver static information, or we have text-based coaching. But I think sort of as you get into this idea of a AI bot that's listening and in real time giving you feedback, like the learning potential there and the development potential is really incredible.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned voice as well, because that's another method to increase equitable access, because not everybody's going to be able to type or even be familiar with that, or they may be disabled and not able to type.
Yeah, all the technologies we're working with right now are both voice and tapping. I think diagnostics is in mental health. There's a lot of opportunity that also can bring down costs. We're not there yet, but there are models that if I have you speak into your phone for 1 minute, tell me how your day is, based on the acoustic and semantic quality of your voice, with a high degree in probability, we can make at least a screen for psychotic symptoms, depression, anxiety. And if you add to that all the passive data that just based on your speech patterns, your activity and sleep, and your social media posting, which is all right here, we can actually detect mental illness a lot earlier. Now, this stuff isn't really scaled yet, but it's coming, and that's going to help across the globe in terms of improving
I would
care.
imagine with computer vision as well, being able to detect, for example, in a video call, people's facial expressions, and that, of course, brings up privacy and security concerns.
Yeah.
I see Ganesh over here nodding his head with that. So I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, I think when we look at the evolution of models, we talked about voice, we talked about video, we talked about essentially all forms of interaction mediums. The notion of multimodal AI is coming. And we're experimenting with things around computer use and how do you detect and how do you create an experience that is essentially visual in nature and natural. The notion of communicating with your fingers is it really should be dead by now, but it isn't yet. And I think that's where we see the evolution of new form factors. So it's part of it is the challenge is the physical characteristics of a keyboard and a PC and a device today. But we're looking at things like, what is it? What can a device attach to your ear? What can that do? What can a pendant attach to your outfit? What can that do? So they're listening devices, they're video devices, they're all multimodal in nature. And so long as, again, the data remains secure, and depending on the policies of an organization, if it remains within your premises, then you can actually do a lot of things with that in a privacy intact manner.
Yeah, and the passive wearables as well.
Indeed.
Yeah, and we, since the 60s, Paul Ekman did the work around facial expression and the association with different discrete emotions. And we've trained therapists in that for decades, including myself when I was in training, to recognize when is a patient, help you detect emotion in the room, which is such an important part of mental health. But with the video, now you have facial action coding. You can use AI just based on a video stream observing an encounter, it's powerful information that can come out of that can feed into then both diagnostics, but also how's the therapeutic alliance and where's this treatment going.
I want to bring us back a little bit. I mean, of course, tech is not only, and innovation is not only AI. It's the hot topic, right? It's the buzzy topic here in Davos again for like year number 3, I think, at least. Year number 4. Okay, some of the audience, I haven't been here that many years. Other topics, I like what you were saying there about diagnostics, right? Because when we really think about health equity and how do you really, have people live longer, make healthcare available, most health systems around the world, public or private, do pay for intervention. So universal health coverage, if you show up with a substantial lump, it's covered, and your cancer care is, your chemotherapy, your surgical intervention is covered. If you have a specific infectious disease, the actual medicines are provided. There are either it's funded by the universal health coverage, or even in low middle income countries, often philanthropy is funding the medicines. But the problem is diagnostics really has not reached a lot of the underserved. And that's in high-income countries, in underserved areas of high-income countries, but also certainly in low and middle-income countries. So whether that's a very basic community health worker type of diagnostics, potentially digitally enabled, Medtronic Labs does some really interesting work there in Africa as an example, or whether that's a more complex diagnostics with a blood test. So, what can we determine from a blood test, and do people have access to those things? And I mean, that's really one of the fundamental shifts in healthcare, is to bring diagnostics from an equity perspective.
I think that's a really important point that you brought up. And particularly we think about the fact that there is a 9.6 year globally gap between health span and lifespan. So that means that the last decade in the US is actually 12.4 years. People are suffering from chronic diseases that are non-communicable. And so a lot of what you're talking about, the early diagnostics, could certainly be a factor. I think the other thing is prevention. And so you're nodding your head. Would you like to address how we can use technology and innovation to address that and get ahead of it?
Yeah, part of what in the public health, your name is joining. I really appreciated your contributions in the first session. If you think about from a population perspective, how do you recognize early folks where things are starting to go amiss, and then how do you intervene early? And in the mental health, recognizing the early psychotic symptoms that can have a devastating impact on the course of that person's life, but also incredible impacts on the family and on the broader healthcare system in terms of costs, and all the healthcare costs associated. So I think, screening technology, I'm really excited about how a lot of these technologies we're talking about can help us reduce the cost of screening, earlier recognition, and then navigating patients and their families to the right solution. But it has to be in the context, so you can't just have the technology. You have to have a place to send patients to get the type of care that they need. And so that's why, I'm very careful to emphasize both the capacity building of an ecosystem with the technology to help facilitate.
Yeah, I wonder if you might be able to speak to the fact that there's only about 2% of the global healthcare spend that goes into mental health, and yet the Green Berets say that it's a force multiplier to address mental health, and that's why they not overinvest, but they invest heavily in that. So I was wondering if you could talk about, or any of you could speak to how we might be able to use some innovation here.
Well, Natasha's work in Ukraine, I think, is a great example where she has been leading efforts to train healthcare workers and now chaplains in the military in stress first aid, which is an evidence-based intervention that helps build resilience and coping, but also helps recognize when someone needs more. Where the distress levels or the trauma stress is such that they need, higher level of care. And I think, that's an intervention that works, and particularly in crisis situations. We used it in the pandemic. A lot of our nurses and healthcare workers were experiencing high burnouts and demoralization. Trained 50,000 of our employees in stress first aid, and we've been really encouraged by the results. I think technology can help. Again, the technology can help implement that at a lower cost and augment it. But you still need the human expertise, and you need to train people. I haven't seen anything yet where you can just implement stress first aid with an app. But there are apps out there, like we have an app we've developed that will help coach you in stress first aid. But there's still that critical translation.
And I think with all sorry to interrupt you, go ahead.
I want to just, this is such a great thread to run down. And John, you talked about how technology can be a huge help here, but in addition to the technology, there needs to be a place to send the patient. I think the last variable that's worth considering is also the cultural and social circumstance around mental health and other types of care dynamics. So I grew up with a mother who's a therapist. So we would sit around the table and talk about our feelings. That was very comfortable. I've been doing a lot of work in Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine 8 times since the start of the war. And what we've seen is not only is there not the physical infrastructure, the literal stock is not sufficient to receive people in such a way that creates a positive association and allows the delivery of effective care. But there's also a very different cultural relationship with going out and seeking medical care. And so as much as technology can help drive early detection and push forward a lot of the actual medical and treatment options at an earlier stage in a more preventative way, I think it's a real mistake to view technology in a vacuum. And I think it needs to be considered, just to round out this point, in conjunction with the actual place where the people go, the people, and the social cultural context surrounding that whole ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dustin. And I'm thinking this morning, Laura was also talking about the climate crisis and how that was going to increasingly displace people and create more issues around sanitation and access to health care. So anticipating that we're in an environment that will produce more chaos from that, how can we use technology and innovation to anticipate that and use our healthcare dollars to help people?
I'll give a really raw answer to this question because it hits quite close to home for me. As I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I've seen the destruction that war brings firsthand. Just last week, my family's home in Los Angeles burned down. And when you look at the photos of LA, it looks exactly the same as Ukraine. It is, you can't tell the difference. And I just had this bizarre realization, like, okay, when a bomb goes off, it starts a fire. And the fire is what burns out the washing machines and leaves the rusted spoons on the ground. The same thing you see in Los Angeles is the same thing you're seeing in Bucha, in Irpin, in eastern Ukraine. And what that made me think a lot about is, unfortunately, war in Ukraine might be the best proxy we have for the climate catastrophes of tomorrow. What you see in Ukraine is massive destruction, massive dislocation of people, massive migration within a country that is placing tremendous stress on the healthcare infrastructure and the social services of a region that is now under capacity where before it was over capacity. You're seeing a situation where investment dollars, state and government focus has to go towards responding to the crisis itself instead of the healthcare and the needs of the people. And so I think what's really important, and I don't want to front run the next panel too much, but what's really important is designing healthcare infrastructure that is climate resilient, and then also acknowledging that the forces of nature are greater than the forces of man, and we need to be able to respond in a quick and timely manner to those types of shocks. And that's why for us, we've identified modular construction technology as a really powerful tool that has not been, in my view, adequately adapted and applied to this kind of use case.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could also speak, because we have 3 representatives from large corporations here, and you've got a lot of resources to bring to bear. If you could address how your grassroots initiative, if there's any lessons from that the rest of us could learn and apply.
Yeah, well, so I'll give a little bit of my origin story. I come from the commercial real estate finance and investment world, and I was working for a major global investment and development firm when on February 24th, 2022, I watched Russia commenced its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I sat watching in horror, wondering how something like this could possibly happen in the 21st century. I ended up deciding that I needed to do something to help, I reached out to every organization, asked them how I could help. They all said, give us money and go away. I hated that answer. I'm kind of a stubborn person. And so I got on a plane, went over to Eastern Europe, and right before I got on that plane, I got connected to a Ukrainian couple living in Washington, D.C. And they said, great, you're heading to the border. We're going to send you supplies so that you can bring them to someone on the border and they'll bring them into the country. So I'm sitting in my apartment in Los Angeles. All of a sudden, I have hundreds of tourniquets, traumatic medical wound bandages. This is a healthcare room. I don't have to say that. Show up at my door. I pack them into a duffel bag, fly them across the world, bring them to someone at the border, hand them to someone to bring into the country, and I felt great. The next day, I got a video of my bag with my checked luggage tag still attached, being unloaded all the way by the front lines in Kharkiv. And that's when I realized we really can make a difference. And to land the plane on your question, the way we can make a difference is by empowering the local individuals, the local community that understands what's going on better than any of us. And then by connecting them to global resources. And so what we did in the initial inception of Sunflower Network, before we were focused on delivering infrastructure, we were delivering aid, and we delivered almost $5 million of aid by serving as that bridge between global institutions, global individuals, global high net worth family foundations that wanted to help, and the amazingly robust, as you know, network of Ukrainians on the ground who were already doing all the hard work. They were just choked off from the global flow of resources.
Thank you so much. I want to go back a little bit to Ganesha, and I know your HP has done some work on the future of work, and I'm wondering what takeaways you might be able to take that in light of what Justin just said, and also what John was talking about in terms of repowering or reskilling people to be able to address some of the challenges in healthcare that we don't have enough healthcare workers to do it. So are there any learnings that you could take away from the future of work studies?
Yeah, I mean, and this sort of takes perhaps a more horizontal lens in the context of future of work. And by that I mean we see healthcare professionals largely as knowledge workers, and then of course there's some who are on the front lines as well. So there's that split. What we're doing right now is studying what does it mean in the world of AI. What does the future of work mean? And we split that into two different parts. There is the future worker, and then there's the work of the future. And those two warrant separate analyses. And the future worker tends to be, we view it as sort of a generational shift as we see younger folks entering the workforce and their expectations from a technology perspective and a productivity perspective. We've studied that trend in the current generation of employees, and we see a lot of tension between organizations looking for growth and workers looking for fulfillment. So this tension is very real, and so how you navigate that and make sure you serve both sort of parties is really important. And then there's the work of the future. And the work of the future is a little bit more complicated because it's evolving really fast, just across every sector, and certainly healthcare as well. We have looked at the life cycle, the journey of a nurse and a nurse practitioner, and what that looks like, and how you can augment that with technology, and how that can be a lot more productive and fulfilling for the nurse. And so a lot of that studying we've done in specific areas. But I think to me that the future of work construct is enabled a lot by AI and tech. And I also want to honor the comments made by my fellow panelists, which is it cannot be tech for tech. That doesn't make any sense. It's very much a human-centric approach. But I also want to put out one other point, which is there's a lot of discussion around, and I'll go back to the radiologist joke, so to speak. It's not really a joke, but it's a thing, where there's a lot of these sort of concern around job losses in the short term and what implications there may be. So when we think about the future of work, we see humans being superpower humans. And I don't say that just to be cliche, because if you think about how technology has evolved, we build technology for ourselves. We build it for humans. So long as we remain the center of consumption and the unit of consumption is the way I call it, I think we will all evolve, and it's going to be very interesting to see how we gain a whole lot more superpowers as technology continues to evolve.
Okay, one final comment here from Tisha.
Yeah, I want to maybe build a little bit upon that and take us to one other topic, which is I would be remiss sitting here at WEF, where we last year launched the Global Alliance for Women's Health, right? And when you really think about health equity, 70% of the health workforce is female, less than 25% of leadership in the health workforce is female. And unfortunately, there's a very, very small portion, somewhere around 2 to 3% of investment in technology for health goes to women's specific solutions. It's really a huge gap, but the decision makers are primarily male and are often forgetting that women make 70% of the health decisions in any household, right? So when we think about health equity and the application of tech, I think we have a long way to go in truly investing in solutions and making women's health a priority. And that will absolutely lift all boats, right? So it's not about not investing in technology that benefits men, but just as an example, women have a 75% greater chance of dying of heart attack if they show up in an ED, because the signs and symptoms are so different, but most physicians are not trained that those signs and symptoms are so different. So tech can be part of the difference there. Recognizing the equity opportunity there, I think, is also a topic. And I know we want to open it up to the audience, right? So I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say one thing before that, which is that also I found out that Alzheimer's also disproportionately affects women. And globally, women actually in the developing world are responsible for more of the income than men. So it's really significant if you look at the World Bank figures. So we need women to be productive members of society.
Could
and
I just quickly add to
Yes.
that a comment? I also, it has to do with race and other types of, a lot of the apps are centered on white experience, at least in the U.S. And so like Blackfulness is a lot of mindfulness apps. Blackfulness is an example of an app that really centers African-American experience and sort of and uses that and just the whole design of the app and how it trains people. And so just like, it's a whole racism and inequity, that exists and kind of garbage in, garbage out. But as we design these apps, really, there's the access to them, but there's also the sort of the content and such. So.
Questions
Hi,
over here.
my name is Manoj Gursani. I run a healthcare startup from India, Mumbai. So especially, Tisha, you mentioned about the breast cancer thing. So I'll just take a step back. So India, we have recognized oral, breast, and cervical cancer are the huge ones. And now, with the use of non-invasive technology, these are all, you can do early screening and prevention of that. The challenge is when you deal with the not-for-profits down to get the data, and obviously data hygiene, etc., they don't have enough money to sustain to the ground level to build the ground truth model. So you had a related pointer, which I wanted to throw it open, is how do you monetize those guys without supporting on foundation, CSR, and grants, etc., but they can be, and someone I was talking about tokenization of data, etc., to see that it's a virtuous cycle. Then you're getting the data, it's anonymized, it's, those kind of things. So I'll just leave that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and this is by no means my idea or Siemens Healthineers' idea, but and there's many people who've come with it. But we funded some students at National University Singapore, both in the health medical school and in the business school, to look at, taking from a microfinance perspective, what do patients have that they can potentially pay for their screening with, any type of screening, cardiovascular screening, whatever it is. And could a patient put together, be willing to give anonymized data, and it is truly possible, of their scans, the result is available, their family history, maybe the results of a blood test, because a scan alone is not terribly useful to someone who's designing an algorithm. Who would buy that, and what would they be willing to pay, right? Is this a reality, particularly for unbiased data? And this group of students looked at 4 potential payers. They looked at insurance companies, they looked at governments, they looked at med tech companies and tech companies designing or doing research, and found that 3 out of 4 of those entities would pay somewhere around 250 euros. That's the value of that data in a full package of anonymized data, which is more than enough to fund, we've looked at it in Africa, with 80 euros a year, you could do very strong diagnostics on an ongoing basis on a patient population. So it's an interesting idea. I'm waiting for that super smart microfinance person to figure it out. I mean, we're maybe not the best ones to figure that out, but we'd love to jump in there with somebody to do that. And I've never heard anybody doing it yet, but every time I bring it up, somebody says, yeah, I've heard that here, I've heard that there. So if somebody knows somebody's actually doing it, I would love to know that. Let's talk afterwards.
Thank you. Super interesting. Are there more questions?
Yep. Hi, my name is Simon from Climeworks. Very interesting panel, and I loved how many positive examples were shared that contribute to more health equity. Just a bit from a more provocative angle, maybe. Tech can also be neutral, and what you do with it defines if it's a positive or a negative contribution to health equity. Just making an example, if we look at, let's say, the degree of digitalization of the healthcare systems, I would assume so that in the first world countries it's a higher degree, which is contrasted maybe by less digitalization in third world countries. I mean, this is just an assumption now. With AI coming in, do we risk now that there is a decoupling of first world countries producing an even higher degree of quality versus maybe a more stable progression in the third world countries? And if so, how can we address this? I believe this is maybe rather a midterm problem and not maybe a long-term thing, but still something we should think about, no?
I think that it's a great question, and to be provocative right back, I think there's actually the opportunity for the exact opposite to happen. So in the last panel, you guys talked about the bi-directional learning from developed economies to more vulnerable situations. I think some of the more wealthy, more well-established nations are going to be more entrenched in their ways and slower to adopt new technology. And again, I'll just use Ukraine as an example. Like, everything is digitized in Ukraine. Everything. I live in New York City now. Like, I can't go to a bar without having my physical ID on me. So the idea that America is in a position to better utilize data and better utilize technology is just not true from my experience. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the countries that are less developed, that are less entrenched in their ways, and therefore more willing to take that leap.
I would argue there's also some developed countries that are doing things differently. For example, you mentioned Denmark. They have a whole patient registry. It's longitudinal. There's lots of studies coming out of that, and drugs are being developed because of from breast cancer research and so forth. In fact, I just learned yesterday that in China there are AI-only hospitals, no humans. So it's not just the developing world. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for the panel. I'm curious to swap to actions based on the conversation. So if you could pick an initiative that you would start or put efforts or resource towards that would propel towards health equity, where do you think the most impact would be?
Just a brief answer from my side would be empowering community health workers, primary health care to do more screening and diagnostic, applying tech to that, getting people into the reimbursed health system.
And I would say scaling a network of high-quality modular healthcare infrastructure that can be rapidly deployed and then rapidly flexed in situations like Ukraine, in northern Israel, in Gaza, in Los Angeles. I mean, unfortunately, the need is tremendous. And we at Sunflower Network see a real opportunity on the infrastructure side. Yeah.
I think there's some early interventions that we can do. For example, teaching people how to do meditation. Meditation's free, and there's a lot of research that shows how beneficial that is for our health outcomes.
Yeah, I would agree with both, and I think telemedicine it's here now. It's been here for a while, and there's a lot. It's simple in a way, and we're using it now to provide like real-time surgical consults from New York to the battlefield in Ukraine, or we have a telepsychiatry consultation service that we offer to rural clinics in Ecuador. And I think there's a lot, like on the margins, it doesn't cost us much. And there's a lot of folks who want to participate and contribute their professional skills. So something as simple as Zoom, I think is a it's hardly technology, I suppose, anymore, but it's pretty powerful in a very tangible way. The other point for me would be really thinking about how you equip folks, non-professionals, to meet like lay counselors, CHWs, sort of providing behavioral activation, other types of treatments that are empirically supported. And I think technology can help there, but there's also the stress first aid, and we were just in Ukraine last week. And technology can help, but you also need, you know, the face-to-face, I think, as well.
I wasn't going to ask any questions since I'm up a little bit later, but on the question that was asked on the equity issue and the answer you gave, and I agree with you, that developing countries not entrenched in their ways and eager to reduce the gap. But there's a reason why the MDGs of 2000 had a goal of technology transfer, and why in 2015 the SDG included technology transfer. Because in case you don't know, every developing country right now wants AI and all the technology. They want to do it, they're eager to do it, they're ready to do it now. But the elephant in the room, these are not inexpensive things. And when a country is spending $7 per capita on health, or 15, or even 300, the question before us today is, will AI, will the explosion of technology in health widen the gap, or will it reduce and erase the gap? It's the elephant in the room, and in 2030, we will replace the SDG, and we will still have the goal of bringing technology to the developing country. Let's not just put the thing under the rug. It's there.
Thank you very much. It's a very good point. I'm encouraged to see that there are open platforms now that are giving the databases away, so it's becoming a little more accessible than it was even 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I was going to, thank you for bringing that up. I was going to respond, but we went on to the next question. I have a different view than that of my panelists on this topic, and I share the view of the gentleman who just spoke, which is there's a significant, there was a conversation I had earlier today about ChatGPT, simply ChatGPT, and the cost of building ChatGPT and the R&D dollars that went into it, something in the realm of about $6 billion. If we were to build ChatGPT from scratch today, it would be about 1/12 that cost. The reason why that matters is that who's using the paid versions of ChatGPT, and where's that adoption, where's that investment happening? And there's an affordability element to this. So I don't buy into the argument that, you know, when you start later, you have a significant leapfrogging advantage, and you should. That's what technology is all about. But make no mistake, the R&D aspect of some of these things are significant. The question and the point you made is exactly the thing that I think we need to think about, which is, does this widen or narrow the gap? And I think it's incumbent upon us. I'll tell you some of the conversations we're having on even large language model development. We're talking about in the context of, yes, we have a US version, but several countries in the Middle East are looking to develop their own. Why? Because the cultural aspects, the point you made, the cultural aspects, the nuances, the historical perspective, all those things matter. And so how those things get developed in offshoots of the technology that's been developed here is very important. So I think I am an eternal optimist as well. I see these things as an opportunity to narrow the gap, but we got to work on it. It's not going to happen on its own.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we're going to have to wrap that, but I wanted to thank these fantastic panelists for your participation, super interesting insights, and also to Northwell Health, Dahlberg, and the Health Finance Institute for having us. And with that, I hope that you take some of these lessons and go forward with some partnerships to bring innovation to close the health equity gap. Thank you.